Well, hello, I'm Doug Apple, back with another special interview for you today. And we start with this question: what is the Johnson Amendment? It impacts our churches and pastors and what they can talk about when it comes to politics and elections, or does it? The Johnson Amendment is named after Lyndon Johnson. It goes all the way back to 1954, but it's back in the courts and back in the news and back in the courts of public opinion. I even see people posting about it. So let's turn to our favorite attorney for insights into this, Mr. Mike Sharman. He's the legal counsel for Share Healthcare. And Mike, let's dive into this Johnson Amendment. So first of all, for those who don't know, just tell us, what is the Johnson Amendment?
The Johnson Amendment was a reaction by Lyndon Johnson, who was mad at a couple of nonprofits who had opposed him while he was a senator. This wasn't while he was a president. This was done in July of 1954. So not, it is, three-quarters of a century ago. And there already had been the 501c3 law, the IRS law that said nonprofits are exempt from taxation and you can make donations to them and get tax deductions, et cetera. That had already been in place. What he added was a sentence or a phrase to the definition of what those entities are. And he added this one phrase, and which does not participate in or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. All right, so that was a restriction on the speech of all nonprofits. It's really only been threatened against churches and specifically pastors. And it wasn't debated. It was just dropped in there and passed because he was a pretty powerful senator. So, senators do that. They just drop in these things. You get these big omnibus bills. You find out about their impact years later, and bam. So that's the Johnson Amendment. It's been vastly expanded beyond its own language, because remember it says which does not participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distributing of statements in a political campaign. All right, so, and then let me finish that to it, or on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. So it doesn't mean you can't speak on public policy. It doesn't mean that you can't talk about it. You're not allowed to participate in it or intervene in. Well, but there's no definitions because this was never really fleshed out, and yet that's what it was used for. So anyway, that's the Johnson Amendment, and what it really wound up being was a great big huge club used by the atheist and anti-Christian entities against churches, schools, and any parachurch organization that they didn't care for. So this earlier this week, our interviews run for a while. So at the beginning of the week following 4th of July, July 7th, the parties in a case in a federal court down in Texas were the National Religious Broadcasters and the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. And they did a really momentous joint motion for entry of consent judgment. And the thrust of that consent judgment is that nothing could be brought against a church or a pastor, the specific church and pastor that were at issue there. And it says, based on speech by a house of worship to its congregation in connection with religious services through its customary channels of communication on matters of faith concerning electoral politics viewed through the lens of religious faith. In other words, perfectly okay for a pastor to get up and say, such and such a candidate is totally against our biblical worldviews. Therefore, I think all of us should vote against them, and I, for one, am going to. That's perfectly permissible under this joint motion by the IRS, the National Religious Services, and this particular church, Sand Springs Church, and First Baptist Church down in Texas, which, of course, would be, it's not one of those nationwide injunctions that you hear about, but the fact that the IRS had agreed to this makes it a national issue. And from what I understand, they're going to be doing some rulemaking to more appropriately codify this. So that's what how its impact, and it's huge. Just driving into work today, I passed by a building that we have here in town that houses a couple different churches. It has, a number of churches in this building. And brand new is a sign put in their flower bed that said, vote for such and such a candidate for town council. That never would have happened before. And that's what we want. We want churches to be able to say, we're the most dominant entity in America. There's more churches than there are McDonald's and Chick-fil-A's. And we ought to be able to have a voice in what goes on in the culture of America. So what it also is telling us is, if you just use some spiritual muscle and legal muscle and moral muscle, you can get over the things that appear to be great big huge barriers in your culture. I mean, this Johnson Amendment was presumed to be a huge wall, barrier between the church and any political activity. And yet it wasn't. What I've told churches when they ask about it, I say, okay, well, the worst that could happen under the Johnson Amendment is that you would lose your 501c3 status. All right. How many, and that only affects the people in your church that actually do the long forms and have itemized deductions. There aren't that many of those. As a church, you might be now a for-profit entity, but all you have to do is the same thing that GE does, and that's build more capital improvements or raise salaries and zero out your income. So what? So you lose it. And even if you pay tax, so what? Jesus said, go fish, find a coin, don't worry about it. But with this new joint motion for entry of judgment, all that goes away. Those walls of Jericho, so to speak, have just come tumbling down. And what's important for us to realize is how much the church in America has been cowed by this, the Johnson Amendment, how much it's stopped them. I mean, just think of the change in our culture from 1954 to now. And before, the church was the bastion of moral thought and the proponent of morals in culture. And it has been silenced by this fiction, this hallucination, this theory without a real basis since then. And look at what's happened in those years from 1954 to now, 2025. Now, on the positive, think of what can now happen when the church has its voice restored. The laryngitis, the muteness of the church is gone. And what we want to be doing, too, is having this be a call to really look at what rights we have. Because the Johnson Amendment, any legal scholar has always known it had no constitutional basis. It was against everything our nation had been founded on, not just in theory, but in law. So here we are at entering into our 250th celebration of our Declaration of Independence. The beginning of the celebration was announced July 3rd this year, and it'll go through to July 4th, the massive celebration to next year, 2026, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Well, prior to that, in June of 1776, in my state, Virginia, George Mason had written the bulk of what's known as the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Now, note the time, June 12, 1776. It was written immediately preceding our Declaration of Independence, and it was used as the basis of the Declaration of Independence. And James Madison, who's, I'm in Madison County and just went and visited his home, Mount Pillier, just the other day. He wrote the section on religion. So the reason I'm mentioning these things is we want to begin remembering, okay, some of the siding on the house of our nation might need repainting, might need scraped. We might need to pull off some of the boards because they've been termite ridden. but the foundation is solid and secure. Let's look at that. So these are some of those foundation blocks. So that Section 16 of the Declaration of Rights said, religion, or the duty which we owe our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. And therefore, all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience, and that it's a mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity toward each other. That was the law in Virginia. And that was what was really incorporated by Thomas Jefferson just a few weeks later, July 4th, 1776, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he said, we hold these truths, and he put it with a capital T, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator, and he put that with a capital C, with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then here's the part of these 54 words that change the world. Here's the part that most people ignore, forget, or just try to remove, that to secure these rights, which rights are these? The inalienable rights that were given to us by our Creator, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Boy, is that a packed statement right there. Government was only instituted to protect our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And they only get their just powers, the appropriate powers, from us by our consent of the governed. And then Thomas Jefferson had a number of things that he put on his tombstone. He had written his own tombstone ahead of time. And one of the things that he asked to have put on it was not that he was a president, not that he had been Secretary of State, not all those different things, but that he had written Virginia's Act for Religious Freedom, which came 10 years after the Declaration. It came January 16th, 1786 in Virginia. And it was a Virginia law. And it says, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free. All right, now that's Jefferson, who supposedly isn't a Christian. Mm-hmm. Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence by temporal punishment or burthens or by civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who, being both Lord of body and mind, chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as it was in his almighty power to do so. Did we get that? Okay. God could have just forced us to believe in him. Yeah. He could have just put into our mind a microchip that just did, and that we all had the Bible inscribed in every single letter in our brain, and we could never vary from it. Well, he didn't do that. He gave us the greatest gift. The only thing that God is not sovereign over is our free will, because he gave it to us as a gift so that we in turn could give it to him as a sacrifice. Well, Thomas Jefferson understood that, and that to him, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of religion, was the core foundation from which everything else sprang. And our nation's laws follow that. You know, the Northwest Ordinance was written July 13th, 1787, and that was one of the first laws written after we had won the Revolution, after we were constituted as these United States. And by Northwest, they meant that this is what was now going to deal with all those new lands we just got, north and west of the original colonies. And Article 3 of that says, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. Why are schools and education being encouraged? Well, because religion, morality, and knowledge, says Congress, is necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind. So for the Johnson Amendment to ignore these basic things that were the foundations for our Constitution ignores the Constitution, because they were the foundations for it. But we don't have to go back and look at those for our justification. We can look specifically at the Bill of Rights, which were proposed on September 25th, 1789, and ratified December 15th, 1791. The First Amendment, and the first phrase of that First Amendment, says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. All right, well, that takes care of the religious aspect, but what about pastors speaking? Is that or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances? Well, all but that last one, the petition of the government, all but the last one were totally wiped out by the Johnson Amendment, and yet pretty much every church in America just said, oh, I guess we got to shut up. We don't have free exercise of religion anymore. We can't have our pastors say what he thinks we need to hear as a congregation. His freedom of speech is cut off because, well, Johnson slipped this thing into the IRS law. And we can't publish because Johnson slipped this thing into the IRS law. I don't want to be too hard on pastors, but what on earth were they thinking?
I don't know. I mean, I know some pastors who didn't care about that.
Yeah, and as you phrased it, some.
Some, yes. But I also know others who were very, careful that they did not want to, in their words, probably break the law.
Well, which was the lawbreaker? The pastor who spoke because he had the right to, or this then senator who inserted into a text something that was totally contrary to the theory, philosophy, and law of our nation?
Well, you told me off the air, I don't think you've mentioned it, what Johnson's personal motivation was.
Yeah, he was, as a senator, he had been attacked with publications by a number of nonprofits, not churches, but nonprofits, which is why he got inserted that language that no nonprofit would participate in or intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office. He just wanted to try to shut up the people who were acting out the First Amendment. Now, getting back to this joint motion for entry, it is only dealing with churches. It doesn't deal with nonprofits, parachurch organizations, but those would necessarily follow this same thing because the reasoning and the basis for it underlying it is still there too. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of speech or the press. The Johnson Amendment just totally blows past all those protections that we as individuals have and say, well, because I'm a powerful senator, I can get this into law, and because the IRS is the scariest thing known to man, you're going to shut up and sit down and do what I tell you.
So I see a lot of people online acting like the sky is falling if we lose the Johnson Amendment. Why are these people getting weirded out about this?
Because how has our culture changed since 1954 when it was impacted? The family's eroded. Moral values that are commonly held moral values have been eroded. Commonly held moral values are what hold us together as these United States. You might have people who were believers, unbelievers, but they all had the basic premise that the Ten Commandments were a good thing to follow, even if they didn't call them the Ten Commandments. That they, even if they weren't Christians, they did what James Madison wanted them to do and had forbearance, love, and charity toward each other. That old phrase, which definitely was not true in the past 10 years of, well, I'm an American, I can say what I want, or you're entitled to your own opinion, you're entitled to, say what your opinion is. That's Christian forbearance, love, and charity toward each other. And that has been blown past because of people trying to coerce others not to say things they don't want.
Mm-hmm.
Christ and Christians don't need to quail before the opinion of others in the free marketplace of ideas. Christ and Christianity will always win out if it has the same opportunity to come into the marketplace of ideas and speak freely. It's attractive. It's winsome. It's logical. It fits all rationality. It's historical. It's provable. All those things that make people want to follow it if they actually hear it and understand it. Using an example how education and knowledge helps us want to do things. When I just mentioned all these underpinnings to our nation's freedom and our religious liberty, I bet there's a fair amount of your audience that had never heard those things. I mean, specifically heard those documents or those quotes, because they aren't mentioned. They're paraphrased or they're totally contradicted. You know, we hear that Jefferson had said that there ought to be a wall of separation between church and state. If so, why did he put on his tombstone that he was the author of the Statute for Religious Freedom in Virginia, which says, and it's the law, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, etc. Obviously, he wasn't meaning that there ought to be a no God zone in government. He just obviously did not mean that. What he meant was government's not going to come into your church and tell you what to do. And, except for a future Senator Johnson.
So where does it stand right now as we record this interview?
You mean, where does this judgment stand?
Yes.
Well, the parties have submitted the joint motion for entry of consent judgment, which included and attached a proposed order and final judgment, which the judge has in his chambers now. May call a hearing just to say, well, let me hear your thoughts on this, or he might just enter it. He has entered a short order saying that everything in the case is suspended, all the prior rules that restricted anything are lifted, the motions for summary judgment are off the table. So it would be pretty extraordinary if he does not sign it, because it is a joint motion of the parties, and they're the ones that have the right to say what they would want done. What his only constitutional thing to do is to look at the order and think, do I have the jurisdiction to sign this thing that the parties, who are the parties to this case, are asking me to? Because the judge always has jurisdiction to determine his jurisdiction. And so that's the only thing. By jurisdiction, it'd be, is this something within the realm of law I can sign? The parties are before him properly. They have subject matter jurisdiction. They have geographic jurisdiction. They have personal jurisdiction. So he's now just looking at, okay, is this within the scope of what I can do? And I think he'll say yes, and then he will sign it. Let's say he doesn't. He does that extraordinary thing and doesn't sign a joint motion. That's very extraordinary. But let's say he doesn't. Okay, well, since this is obviously the view of the IRS, they'll just hop on over to another court and get that court to do it. And, start a new case, ask another court to do it. They will, as I mentioned, be doing new rulemaking to codify this idea. In all likelihood, there'll be a movement within Congress to do a law deleting that phrase from the 501c3 law, which was not be any heavy lifting either. I think it's more important. I think that's an important thing to do so that a future administration can't have their IRS reinstated. We want the law to come out. But I think it's very important for this language of this order, the language of the motion, and the explanations they gave to be entered. I think they're going to.
Well, all right. That's information about the Johnson Amendment. And just while we wrap up our time, Mike, we did mention that you're the legal counsel for Share Healthcare. I guess that's not really connected to the Johnson Amendment per se, but what about Share Healthcare? Well,
I think it really is. Because the Johnson Amendment had put up this fiction that, here's this impregnable wall you can't get past. And so many people think that's true in a lot of the other areas, day-to-day areas of their lives. Most people, or many people, think I have to have insurance, one, because of necessity, or because the state tells me I have to. There's a number of states that still have that individual mandate. But you don't have to. And they think, well, I don't know what else I can do. Well, you can be part of the church. You can be part of exercising that religion or the duty that we owe to our Creator in the manner of discharging it. Share Healthcare is a healthcare sharing ministry. It's a 501c3. ministry. And our mission is helping Christians share one another's medically necessary medical expenses. You don't have to have insurance. There's a different way of dealing with things that we believe is more in keeping with what the Bible would want us to do. The Bible wants us to, as much as possible, bear one another's burdens, encourage one another, exhort one another, build one another up, all those one another verses. And we can do that through this vehicle of sharing one another's medically necessary medical expenses. When we exercise the muscle to do that spiritual muscle of exercising our medical freedom, our financial freedom, our religious freedoms, in coming together in healthcare sharing ministries like Share Healthcare, then we're reinstating the fact that Christian culture is our culture and an important part of America, and it undergirds it. And so some of the proof of the efficacy of our Christian beliefs is that to be a part of Share Healthcare and contribute monthly towards it is $149 for a single, $249 for a couple, $349 for a family of four, and $50 for each child afterwards. So why do I say that's proof of the efficacy of our living out our Christian principles? Well, just think of the prices: $149, $249, $349, compared to what, $2,600 is the average for how much it costs for a family of four across America to have health insurance. So that lets us know there is a better way. We just have to know about it and then exercise our will to do something about it.
And if people want more information, where can they get it?
Well, first go to the website, sharehealthcare.com, sharehealthcare.com. Write down your questions as you're scrolling through and looking at what to do. Then you can call 1-844-SHARE-HC, 1-844-SHARE-HC, and there'll be somebody there ready to answer those questions that you wrote down.
All right, that's Mike Sharman, as we said, the legal counsel for Share Healthcare. And for Wave 94, I'm Doug Apple.